the book of Proverbs and looking at this could be for some somewhat unfamiliar book, and it's stylistically a little unique because it's a genre of literature that's called wisdom literature. And of course, we don't really have that. I mean, in our modern day genres of literature, wisdom literature isn't as prevalent as it was this time. But as you should know, that Proverbs wasn't the only wisdom literature book out there at the time. Every culture, Egyptian culture, Samaria, even China, they had Proverbs, and they collected these because they knew that wisdom was important. They knew that in order to live a controlled life, in order to live a disciplined life, in order to live a life where you're happy and you're fairly content, that you needed wisdom above and beyond everything else. And so they collected all of these wisdom sayings, and they passed them down from cultures. And the one that we get passed down in the Christian tradition is this book of Proverbs. And it's, as we'll see over the next many weeks, it's really extremely invaluable in the way that it imparts wisdom, the way that it tells us how to deal with things like relationships and money and career and decision making that we might make, decisions that we might have to make. But we have to read the book the right way. And last week, we did an introduction to it, and this week we're still going to be doing a little more introduction to it. And this is why, and I mentioned this last week for those of you who are here, you remember, but I'm going to repeat it many times actually, because the book of Proverbs can easily be misread, and it often is. You have people quoting a random proverb. They'll open up the Bible and they'll say, look, Proverbs 32:1 says this, and so therefore that's the rule. And then Proverbs isn't a rule book. It isn't. That's not fundamentally the way it should be treated. And I gave the example last week. There's numerous examples of contradictory proverbs. Proverbs 26:4-5, I said this last week, it's 4 says, don't answer a fool according to his folly, or else. Then in verse 5 it says, answer a fool according to his folly, or else. And you have to wonder, which one is it? They directly contradict each other. And the whole point is that if you and I are wise people, we'll know which one to do at the time that we're supposed to do it. Because let's be honest, I know your lives, there's a lot of stupid people that you deal with on a daily basis, and people who make bad decisions and people who bother you, and you have to answer the question, do I step up and say something to this person, or do I just let it go? And neither response is right all the time. It depends on the circumstances, it depends on the situation, and that's why we need wisdom. And here in Proverbs 2, wisdom, and this is a little frustrating. I know some of you want to get to the wisdom part. You want to get to okay, I have a decision to make in my life. Pastor, just tell me what to do. What does the book say? And this is frustrating because in Proverbs 2, we're not there yet. The father's talking to the son, and by the chapter 2, the son has got to be, you imagine a father talking to a son and saying, I'm going to tell you all about wisdom and tell you how to live your life. And he goes 2 chapters without giving him one piece of valid wisdom. And we don't get it in chapter 2 again. Not until chapter 3. You have to come back next week. There's the hook. If you want a real wisdom, got to come back next week. But the father, the son's got to be looking at him going, I'm sitting here for 2 chapters, Dad. Tell me the answer already. What do I do? But the father, as he's talking to the son, he doesn't give him the answers just yet, because he knows something about wisdom that maybe you and I miss. See, wisdom, according to the book of Proverbs, wisdom is a practice. It's a process. It involves preparation. There's things you and I have to do to work at it, to work and till the soil of wisdom. It's not the only illustration I could have, and it's rather simplistic, so bear with me, is, when you see a fire extinguisher and it's got a sign on it that says, in case of emergency, break glass. And a lot of times when we seek wisdom from God in our life, that's how we treat him. We treat him, well, there's a major decision to make in my life, so now I'm going to go pray. God, I'm praying to you. Now tell me what to do. Just give me the answer. And the father in this passage takes 2 whole chapters before he gets to what wisdom is, to explain the meaning of wisdom to his son and the importance of wisdom to his son, as a way to say, if you want wisdom in your life, it's going to take preparation. It's going to take work. It's going to take you doing a process with God. It's not going to an emergency and breaking the glass, although, to be honest, if you prayed to God in an emergency, I'm sure he'll answer you because he's God and he's cool and he's good and he does that kind of thing for us. But by and large, the book of Proverbs tells us that wisdom doesn't work like an emergency, go break the glass. Wisdom says you need to meditate on this. And this needs to become central to your life if you want the wisdom of God. And so we have 22 verses here in chapter 2 of the father saying, if you do this, son, then this is the benefit. He says, if you do this for wisdom, then wisdom's benefits. And actually, if you have your Bible, some of you, I don't know if it's on your phones, but NIV would put the heading as the benefits of wisdom for this chapter. And the father's trying to tell him, listen, this is why wisdom's so important. But in doing so, I'm going to touch on the benefits, but in doing so, the father reveals some amazing things about biblical and Christian wisdom for us today. And just so you know, if my voice is cracking, it's not puberty. I've dealt with a chest cold and I'm losing my voice, so deal with me. I just totally derailed that one again. I'm great at derailing these sermons, aren't I? Let's get us back on track. First, the father shows us about three things. The father shows us one, what I'm calling the paradox of wisdom. What I'll call the paradox of it. Then he shows us the benefits. He talks about what's the benefit of why, when you get wisdom, what happens in your life. And then lastly, he shows us something rather unique, and it doesn't come through in your translations because the English translation of one of these words in this passage is horribly off. Not horribly, but it's off. And it's what I'm going to call the covenant of wisdom. There's the paradox, and then there's benefits, and there's covenant. Let me jump into this and explain what I mean. First, the paradox. The reasonable question you have to ask when you approach biblical wisdom, all of us in this room, I'm gathering, want to be wise people. I'm just assuming that this morning. I don't think anybody in this room wants to be stupid and make stupid decisions in life. I'm assuming everybody wants to be wise, make wise decisions, and live a happy, content life. But here's the paradox. In verses 4 through 6, the question you would have to ask is wisdom earned, meaning accomplished, or is wisdom given? So you would say, listen, I want wisdom, but I need to know, do I have to achieve it? Do I work at it? Or is it somehow magically given to me if I just pray enough or I sit under a tree and wait for it to fall on me? And the Proverbs answer in verses 4 through 6 is both. The paradox of wisdom is it is both given and it is something that we have to work for. See, he says here to his son, he says, treat wisdom like a treasure. He said, treat it like a hidden treasure. And I'm guaranteeing you that, I don't think many of you don't have backyards, but you may have a closet or something. If I told you that in your closet and underneath the ground there was hidden treasure, you would surely go and start to dig at it. You'd start to work at it. You wouldn't say things like, okay, I know wisdom, I know the treasure's down there, I'll get to it later, I've got to go to work now. No, you'd say, hidden treasure? Of course, let's go dig. And at one time, the book of Proverbs says, yes, wisdom is like that. It takes work. And he uses, in Hebrew, these really powerful words of grasp, he says, and store. And the word store that he uses is similar to storing grain for the wintertime. It involves a lot of work. Basically, the father is saying, if you want wisdom, part of it is you're going to have to work for it. You're going to have to read the Bible. You're going to have to pray. You're going to have to listen to God. You're going to have to spend time with him. It involves work. But here, he also says in verse 6 that it comes from Yahweh's mouth, the Lord's mouth. So at one time he says you have to work for it, but at the other time he says that any wisdom you do get ultimately comes from God anyway, and thus is the paradox. And this will bother many people depending upon which cultural background you come from. If you come from something like a contemporary cultural background, like the United States, very individualistic. We believe that we can achieve everything. We believe that we have to work hard for it. We have to earn it, our education, our degrees. And for us, if coming from that background, a contemporary cultural background, wisdom is something that you achieve. But if you come from a more traditional background, who venerates elders, who respects elders, wisdom, yes, it's sort of achieved, it's earned, but really it's given over time. It's not about your education. It's not about necessarily how smart you are. It's about what's been given to you through life's experiences. And the book of Proverbs says it's not one or the other. It's absolutely both. But we're not just to work at it. We'll receive it as a gift. And it says it comes from the mouth of God. And it says that this is when you'll start to fear God. And I want to do something here. A few of you were here last week when I talked about the fear of the Lord. And this is a common theme in the book of Proverbs. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time unpacking this again. I talked about last week having a negative fear of God and having a positive fear. And on the way home, my wife really helped me to see that I didn't clarify that maybe enough on what it means to have negative fear versus positive fear. And let me give you an idea here. There is a negative fear of that you can have in life. You can be afraid. You can be afraid of other people and their opinions of you. You can be afraid of even your opinion of yourself. You can be afraid that you're going to disappoint God and that he's not going to ever forgive you. And that's a negative fear because it motivates you negatively. You will only do things in it as much as it keeps that fear at bay. If you're afraid of what other people will say about you, you're afraid of disappointing them, you're afraid of even disappointing yourself, and I know there's many of us in this room who experience that. But positive fear is the fear that you have of God when you know that he has forgiven you no matter what you have done. See, negative fear is if you disappoint other people, I guarantee you they're not going to forgive you that easily. They're going to hold it over your head. You're going to be embarrassed. You're going to be ashamed. You might have a negative fear of even disappointing yourself. But a positive fear of God is when you say, I am so in awe of what he has done for me. And let's be honest, we let God down all the time. We disappoint him. But here's the cool part. He's the only God who says, though you will fail me, I can never fail you. Though you disappoint me, I accept you. And Isaiah 43 is the best example of this. God is speaking to his people and he says, but you, meaning us, God says, you have burdened me with your sins. He says, you have wearied me with your iniquities. God's basically saying, you have let me down time and time and time and time and time again. But then in verse 25, he says, but it's me. I am he who blots out your sins for my own sake, and I won't remember. See here, we burden God, and yet he forgives us. And this should melt you. This should create in you a sense of awe and wonder. And the cross is proof of that. The cross, with Jesus hanging on it, is the proof that though we disappoint God, unlike human beings who may turn from us and run, he can never do that. He can't. He's bound to us by what Jesus did for us. And if you don't like the word fear, then replace it with awe. Replace it with wonder. There's a quote inside your bulletin from Socrates that says this very same thing. That wonder is the beginning, wisdom is wonder. When you start to wonder and be in awe of God and what he did for you, that's when wisdom comes. It's paradoxical, and I put a quote in from a guy named Trimper Longman. He's an Old Testament commentator, wrote a great book on Proverbs, and he says, this is the paradox. Seek wisdom, find God. Seek God, find wisdom. And once one does find wisdom, one is to thank God for it. On a practical level, what does it mean for someone who wants to heed the admonition of the Father and become wise? He says, work at it. Study the book of Proverbs and the rest of the Bible. However, the acknowledgement that whatever wisdom we have comes ultimately from God chastens our pride and leads to humility. It does not allow the pursuit of proverbial wisdom to lead to the pride that separates us from God. That's the paradox. It takes work, but ultimately it's a gift. Now, what's the benefit? I'm going to touch on this briefly before the next point, because it's a couple of them are fairly obvious. The benefits you see in verse 11, the words actually translate better as discretion, understanding, competence. What the Father's telling the Son is, if you get to be a wise person, you'll make better decisions in life. And that sounds very self-explanatory, I know. So let me dig deeper here for you, because I know all you guys like to dig deep. We're not going to stay surface level. There's a funny part, if you look at verse 20 through 22 that I had Brian read, where he talks about the land. And he says that the people, basically the wicked, or the people who are not wise, the people who make bad decisions, they're going to be uprooted from the land. And this is kind of weird, not weird, a little foreign to us maybe, because I don't own any land. I don't know if you own a piece of land anywhere. But if you do, I can guarantee you this, that your relationship to the land is entirely different than the readers of Proverbs that these people would have had their relationship to the land. So what is he saying here to the Son? See, ancient Israelites, their relationship to the land was one of personal worth and identity. Even Adam was formed, and his name is closely related to Adama, which means ground, it means earth. Land was everything to these people. Land meant something you could pass on to your children. Land meant your worth. If you had land, the community looked at you different. And if you didn't have land, the community would look at you as cursed. And what he says here is, the benefits are clear thinking and discretion, but there's an even better benefit. That if you and I practice wisdom, we get land, and land, we don't get land. God's not going to pass out parcels of land to you. But he says you'll get worth. You'll find a sense of rootedness. And most importantly, he says that this comes in community. Do you notice that it's all plural? He says if you're wise and you make wise decisions and you seek after wisdom and you dig for it like hidden treasure and you do that work and then you accept the grace and gift of God, you're going to find yourself in community and with a sense of rootedness in your life. So the simple question that you can ask yourself today is, if you're on a trajectory of being wise, you can ask yourself this morning, do I feel more rooted, more secure in my life than I did 6 months ago or a year ago? Do I feel like people around me are holding me accountable for the decisions that I make in my life? Do I feel like I'm letting people hold me accountable? Do I feel like I'm part of a community? If you can answer yes, you're on the way to wisdom. You're making wise choices. Do you feel rooted? See, he says, if you make selfish decisions, unwise decisions in your life, if you make a decision about your career that ultimately just benefits you, you're going to be uprooted. Eventually, you're going to feel lost. You're going to feel confused. You're going to feel like you have nobody around you to anchor you. But if you and I start to make wise decisions in light of the community, and in light of what God's telling us, even when we may not want to make that path, to go that direction in our life, God says, if you do that, that's wisdom. Now, that's the benefits. That's the paradox. And hopefully, if you're here today, I'm assuming you want to be wise. So how do we do it? How do we start? And it's what I'm going to call the covenant. And if you were here last week, you heard me talk about wisdom being a person. Wisdom in the Christian sense and in the book of Proverbs is personified as a woman. And it's woman wisdom. And then later on in the book, we'll see that it's contrasted with woman folly, or the fool, the woman. And there's two decisions. But what the book of Proverbs basically says about wisdom is this. Wisdom is not fundamentally a practice or a program or a book or a technique or a strategy. It's a relationship. Wisdom begins and ends with having a relationship. And you would have to have the relationship with God in order to know his wisdom. And a relationship implies intimacy. And in Proverbs 2, they talk about the intimacy of a covenant. And see, this is why English sometimes fails us. In verse 8, if you look at this, your translation may say something like, he protects the saints or the faithful ones. Faithful ones is the one we read today, and that's a little closer to the meaning. But here's the real word that he uses, and it's a beautiful Hebrew word, and it's the Hebrew word that I want us to sink our teeth into this morning, and it's a word called hesed, H-E-S-E-D, chesed. And this word is so rich, and it means covenant. The better way to translate that is that the Lord protects the covenant partners. And then later on, and he says that the woman, that if you go the wrong path, you've forgotten the covenant. Now, what does that mean, hesed? This word is used most starkly and strikingly in the book of Hosea, one of my favorite books. And it's used in chapter 2. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the book of Hosea, here's the beauty of this word, hesed, or covenant. See, Hosea, he was a prophet. And God came down to Hosea one time and he said, listen, and I'm paraphrasing obviously. You can read this in Hosea 1. He says, listen, Hosea, I want you to be a prophet and I want you to be my prophet. But in order for you to be a prophet, you need to know the relationship that I have with my people. Okay. Hosea says, sign me up. And he says, Hosea, what you're going to do is you're going to go marry this woman named Gomer. And not for one day of her life will she ever be faithful to you. She will run away from you. She will be unfaithful with every other person in the community. And you will continually have to go run after her and go get her. You'll have to do this again and again and again. And God says, when you do this, you will then understand what I have done for my people. How unfaithful they are towards me, and yet I run to them all the time. And there's a beautiful part in the book of Hosea when Hosea has to actually physically go to the marketplace, to the center of town, where Gomer, his wife, is being sold as a slave. And he has to buy her back. And God says, Hosea, when you know that type of relationship, you'll know the relationship that I have with my people. That though they run away from me all the time, and though they seek to make their own decisions, and they think they're in control of their lives, and they go worship every other god, their career, their success, their reputation, every other god that they bow down to, he says, I always run after them. And there's an interesting part in Hosea 2 when he brings this word in, hesed. And he says, despite their unfaithfulness, I make a new hesed with them. This is a beautiful picture of what God does for you and me. And hesed, this word, is translated in the New Testament as eleos, and it pops up again in Romans 9. And Paul's writing to the Christians saying this. Romans 9:23 says, what if God, although willing to demonstrate his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much patience vessels of wrath, meaning you and me, prepared for destruction? And he did so to make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, you and me, which he prepared beforehand for glory. Even us, whom he also called, not from among Jews only, but from among Gentiles. And this is where it gets awesome. Paul quotes Hosea. And he says, as he says in Hosea, I will call those who are not my people, and her who was not beloved, beloved. And it shall be in that place where it's said to them, you are not my people, there they should be called the sons of the living God. Here is what hesed is. If you want wisdom, you have to know that it comes through a relationship with God. But you only, and me, only get that relationship because of the covenant that he established with his son and through his son. This is grace. This is when God looks at you and me and all the disappointments that we've had in our lives and all the dumb decisions that we've made and all the ways we've gone a different path than where he wants us to go. And he looks at all the bad choices we made and he says, today again I make with you a new hesed. This is husband and wife talk. This is intimacy. This is a relationship. Now, wouldn't it be awesome if somebody could walk up to you and say, you are my beloved? And I know some of you have spouses and some of you have boyfriends and girlfriends who you are in love with, and you tell them all the time, I love you, and that sounds good. I know, I love you, I love you. But what if one day, how cool would it be if that person came to you and said, you are my beloved? Wouldn't that be awesome? No? Nobody wants to be called beloved this morning. Beloved is a beautiful word. And God says this, you are my beloved because of what Jesus did for you on the cross. You and I were not his people, but now we are. Now we have a relationship with the one who gives us wisdom, the one who empowers us to know what decisions to make. See now, this is why the Father took 2 chapters to explain what wisdom is to his son before he actually gives him wisdom, because he wants us to see the depth and the breadth of the wisdom of God, that it's not a book and it's not a practice and it's not a technique, it's a relationship, it's an intimate covenant. If you know this morning, if you really know that what Jesus did on the cross was for you and you and you and you and me, if you know this word hesed, that he bound himself to you, this should create fear and awe and wonder, staring at this act on the cross and saying, yes, that's the wisdom I want. And it inspires humility as well, because you're then able to say, though I've messed up in my life so many times, it's God who's continually run to the marketplace to get me back. And the cross is proof of it this morning. Ask yourself this today. Can you say that God looks at you and calls you his beloved? Do you know that? Do you know deep in your heart, for maybe the first time, that he says, I gave my son for you. You are not lovable, but I love you. And you are my beloved. And the cross speaks of that. That's how wisdom starts. That's awesome. Let me pray for you.